All right, this is discussion 12A. I want to talk about Ban Zhao. You're reading the book right now, Instructions for Chinese Women and Girls. And I talked a little bit before about when this was written. Ban Zhao lived in the late 1st, early 2nd century CE in China under the Han Dynasty, and this book was probably written somewhere around 100 CE. I want you to think about several things as you're reading this text. One is, what does this text mean? In other words, when historians look at a document like this, they have to ask some real questions. I mean, for instance, okay, this document tells us this is how women should behave. But the first thing we have to ask is Ban Zhao writing this because she's trying to convince women to behave this way and they're not doing it? That's why she wrote the book, to convince them to change? Or is she writing this book because she recognizes that's how women are already acting and she's just documenting it? And so the question is, how much can we trust this text to tell us what the actual reality is out there, right? But second, at the same time, how can we assess the readership of the text, right? Because for the first question is, well, who read this, right? This is an era before printing, so each copy of this book had to be hand copied. So somebody really had to want to read this, to hand copy it and then, keep a copy. And we really don't, historians, when something is this old, 2,000 years old, we really don't have a lot of copies of it, but we don't know how many copies there were. Right? Was this something that every educated person had to have a copy of in their home? Or was this something that a couple hundred people read? Right? That's an enormous difference, historically speaking. How influential was this book? Right? And we can look at, do other people mention this book? Do other people mention Ban Zhao? And so it becomes, and this book was obviously, peasants in China, most of whom were illiterate and who certainly couldn't afford a book, weren't going to be reading this. So this was middle and upper class people, educated people reading this and owning this, right? And so we have to understand that, but we also have to ask, how did they read this, right? We don't know how they interacted with this book, right? So okay, even though if we can establish how many people had the book, we don't know if they actually opened it and read it. And even if we could possibly establish how many people read it, it's even harder to say how they read it. Did they read it as something funny that they could laugh at? Did they read it as something that was they were going to totally take seriously and teach their daughters this? Or did they read it as sort of well, that's the official story, but we live our lives differently? We don't know. And so it's often interesting to try to figure out from a document what the actual impact of the document was. Did the document change people's minds? Did it convince a lot of people? Did it circulate a lot? And then how much did the document correspond to reality? Right? It's probable, this is just a guess, it's probable that the document circulated fairly widely amongst the educated upper classes, which is a small percentage of the Chinese population. And it's also probable that it reflected a reality, meaning that we can probably trust that Ban Zhao was not making this up to try to convince people to change their ways. She was instead just describing what she saw. But we don't know how much she was, by including all the detail that she includes and the sort of rules and prescriptions, we don't know how much she was actually making a sort of an official version of something that may not have been that official before, right? So she could be amplifying these ideas by giving them a real sort of official form. Here now it's written in a book and it's laid out in great detail, and so it's possible that what had been sort of general cultural rules before that now become very specific and detailed cultural rules. So we don't know how much the book shaped the culture and how much the culture shaped the book, right? But in a larger sense, this document is interesting because there's so very few things written in history, in any culture, about women, right? That in most of the agricultural societies that we've been studying, which are the ones that tend to produce documents and texts and et cetera, they're very patriarchal. So women are assigned to specific, very limited roles. They're generally not rulers. They're generally not merchants. They're generally not soldiers. They're usually restricted to the home and child care and family, etc., under these patriarchal systems. And so women often get taken for granted. And so it is kind of interesting when we come across a document that actually talks explicitly about women. It becomes one of our limited sort of snapshots of what life was like for women. And this is important because women are half of the population, and women are in a really crucial portion of the economy, but they're often completely ignored. And I should say also, peasants are often ignored also, unless they revolt, precisely for the same reason. They're just taken for granted, and they don't have a voice. Because most women are illiterate in China at this time. They're not, and in most patriarchal societies before the modern era, women are illiterate, right? The resources were simply not put aside to teach women how to read and write. And so there are very few women writing. Every culture produces some women who write, but very few compared to the number of men who write. And so we really have a hard time getting a hold of the lives of women. And so a document like this that really lays it out in some detail is really a valuable resource. Although, as I said, it's really hard to figure out what this document means. It's just a document that we've got, and we've got to sort of figure out how much do people listen to this, how much does this actually reflect the way people live, et cetera, how far did this spread, how many people read it. Those are interesting questions to ask about any text, but especially about texts about women. So let me turn then to the second idea, which is, how do women interact with this text? Who's the audience for this? It's instructions for Chinese women and girls. So explicitly the book is written for women. But that doesn't mean that's the audience, right? It could be that who's reading it? It could be that men are the primary audience here, and they're reading it in order to know what they should make their wives and daughters act like, right? Or it's possible that it actually is circulating amongst upper class women who might be literate, but it's an interesting question of who is this actually written for. And on another level, I asked this earlier, but what does this book offer to women, right? What do women get out of reading this? Because clearly the book is putting women in a subordinate position, right? They're supposed to sort of efface themselves before husbands and sons, etc. They're supposed to be submissive to their husbands. They're supposed to be supportive of their sons. They're supposed to do all sorts of things without putting themselves forward. They're supposed to not be noticed. What does a woman get out of this? Well, there's an interesting point that gender historians often make, which is that when you have a set of rules in a society, most groups in a society, if they're assigned a particular place, right, they're given a particular position in society, they can't just become anything they want to. They've been assigned a place. And in Chinese society, in the Han Dynasty, and even in the Tang and Song dynasties, it was really rare that a woman was given an opportunity like Empress Wu to actually do something, world-shaking or politically important. So women's roles were pretty clearly prescribed, and we can see in this document how women's roles are prescribed. But within that prescribed role, Zhao makes it pretty clear that you can do this well or you can do this not well. And so you can think of it this way. Zhao is laying out these rules for women, and they're pretty strict and they're pretty hard to achieve. And so some women are going to do better at being the perfect woman by these rules than other women are. So this document, by making it so rigorous, actually establishes a sort of a goal that's hard to achieve. And that allows some women who can actually achieve this goal and be the perfect wife to sort of succeed as a Confucian woman, whereas other women might not be able to do that, right? And so this document, and you can ask yourself this as you're reading it, how would a woman read this and say, okay, here's my plan. I want to be the best Confucian wife ever. And what are they going to do? How do they do it? And how would they judge other women? Oh, she's not being a very good wife because X, Y, Z. And so even in this position where women are clearly put in subordinate position to men, it still allows a certain latitude, or it sets up a certain standard by which individuals can judge themselves. Am I being a really good Confucian woman, or am I not being a really good Confucian woman? Right? And can I gain social status by having other people recognize that I'm a really good Confucian woman? Right? Or to put it slightly differently, does Ban Zhao seem like a better Confucian woman because she wrote this book showing she knows all the rules of Confucian women? Does she get a certain status from that? And to put it in a different context, you can think of it today. If you think about, or think about 1950s housewives, right? They were clearly put in a subordinate status. They were confined to the home. They weren't supposed to work, but they were clearly also judged on how well they fulfilled that role. A woman, if she wore really stylish clothes and her kids were really well behaved and her house was spotless and was really coolly decorated, she got status for succeeding as a housewife, right? Whereas if her house was a mess and her kids were all brats and her clothes were all a mess, she did not succeed as a housewife. She didn't fulfill the role as well as she could. This book also offers us a vision of that, and so we have to ask, do women who do the things in this book really well, somehow get a certain status, even though the things they're doing are supposed to sort of show their low status, right? It's an interesting question, interesting dynamic. I also want to ask, how a woman at the end of her life, how is she supposed to say, "Yeah, I had a good life," right? How is she supposed to say, "My life has some meaning"? And Ban Zhao offers one interesting thing here. She mentions that it's pretty clear women are supposed to define themselves through the men in their lives. That a woman who has sons is really supposed to define her own success in terms of her son's success. So if her son is successful, she is successful. If her sons are not successful, she is not successful, right? And so there's an interesting way that women are supposed to give their lives meaning through their children. That clearly comes out in this book, right? But this raises the final question I want to ask, which is, what the heck is Ban Zhao doing, right? Ban Zhao was famous for, she was married and then her husband died, and her brother was a famous historian and he died, and so she finished his history and became famous as a historian for finishing his history of China. So she's clearly, and by that very fact, she is not being a good Confucian woman, because she's putting herself out there in her own name. She's accomplishing things in her own name outside of the home. She's not being subordinate to a man. In some ways, she's kind of a failure as a Confucian woman, precisely because she's a successful intellectual. And then she goes and writes another book, which is kind of ironic, that she's completely acting in a non-Confucian way by writing a book and giving advice as a woman, but the advice she's giving is about how women should be subordinate and not should pull attention to themselves, etc. So I want you to ask, in this book, how does she pull that off? And in particular, does she say things in the book to sort of make excuses for herself for why she can write the book? Right? And does she say things in the book to position herself to say, I really am a good Confucian, even though you might not think so because I'm writing a book? Right? So that's an interesting question of how she herself fits into this, because she's clearly putting herself out there as an authority, as an authoritative voice, as a writer, as an intellectual, and none of those are roles that women are supposed to take according to the book she wrote. Right? How does she justify it? One final point. For after you finish the Ban Zhao, there's a handout that's on my courses, and if you go to the course website where you see all the the syllabus and the lecture notes, etc., scroll down to the bottom, you'll see reading handouts, and the Chaucer reading. If the book that you have, the Chaucer version you have, doesn't have the Chaucer, I put all the Chaucer readings there. But also I put a handout called Gender Handout, which is a comparison. Modern historians have done a comparison of classical societies, gender in ancient Greece and Rome, but also China, India, etc. So I want you to, and there are a couple of very short primary documents there, documents about women generated by other societies. In fact, one of them was Ban Zhao, but I didn't include that. So I want you to look at that and compare, how does Chinese Confucianism, the status of women in China, compare to the other societies that we've looked at, and other societies that are portrayed in this gender handout. So that's some thoughts on gender, Confucianism, and Ban Zhao.